Louis Armstrong stopped at the corner of the street and couldn't believe his eyes. A little girl was trying to sell his signed trumpet for $100, but that wasn't even the worst part. 1952, New York City. Louis had stepped out during a rehearsal break to grab something to eat, but the scene he encountered froze him in place. A 14-year-old girl, thin and pale, eyes red from crying, sitting on the sidewalk with a few toys, some old records, and a trumpet laid out in front of her on a worn blanket. Louis approached, curious at first, then suspicious. When he picked up the trumpet and saw the signature on the bell, his heart nearly stopped. That was his handwriting. That was his signature. His first thought was fraud, maybe a fake signature, maybe stolen goods, maybe some kind of scam targeting naive buyers, but then he looked at the girl's face, really looked, and something clicked in his memory. He knew this face. He had seen this girl before. Though months earlier she had come backstage with her father. The father had been crying with joy, the girl had been smiling shyly, and Louis had signed that very trumpet as a gift to them. Now the father was gone, and the girl was selling his most precious memory for $100. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. What Louis did in the next few hours didn't just save this girl from poverty, it changed the entire trajectory of her life forever. So what happened to that father? Why was this girl alone on the street? And what did Louis Armstrong do that turned a moment of tragedy into a lifelong friendship? If this story has already touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, because what you're about to discover is one of the most beautiful examples of human kindness in music history. A story about fate, compassion, and how one act of generosity can ripple through decades. But this story doesn't begin on that street corner in New York. It begins 4 months earlier, on a spring evening in Chicago, when a father and daughter stood nervously outside the stage door of the Civic Opera House, hoping for just one moment with their hero. Harold Mitchell was 42 years old, a factory worker who had spent his entire adult life working double shifts to provide for his family. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 3 years earlier from illness, leaving Harold to raise their daughter Ruth alone. Harold wasn't a rich man. He had never been rich, would never be rich. But he was a devoted father who believed that giving his daughter beautiful experiences mattered more than material possessions. And the most beautiful experience he could imagine was letting Ruth meet Louis Armstrong, the musician whose records had filled their small apartment with joy ever since Ruth was a baby. Harold had saved for 6 months to buy 2 tickets to Louis' Chicago concert. He worked overtime whenever it was offered, skipped lunches to save a few dollars here and there, and finally had enough for 2 seats in the back of the balcony. Not great seats, but seats nonetheless, a chance to see the great Satchmo perform live. Ruth was 11 years old when they attended that concert, and Harold would later say it was the happiest he had ever seen her since her mother died. Ruth sat transfixed throughout the entire performance, her eyes never leaving the stage, her small hands clapping along to every song, her face glowing with a joy that Harold had feared was lost forever after Margaret's death. When the concert ended and the applause finally faded, Harold made a spontaneous decision that would change everything. He was going to try to meet Louis Armstrong. Harold took Ruth by the hand and led her to the stage door, where a small crowd of fans had gathered hoping for autographs. They waited for over an hour, Ruth shivering in the cool spring air. Harold worried that they would be turned away like so many others. But when Louis finally emerged, something remarkable happened. Louis saw the little girl first, saw her wide eyes, her hopeful expression, the way she clutched her father's hand, and instead of rushing past to his car, Louis stopped. He walked directly to Ruth and Harold, knelt down to be at Ruth's eye level, and asked her name. When Ruth whispered, "Ruth Mitchell," in a voice barely audible, Louis smiled that famous smile and said, "Well, Ruth Mitchell, did you enjoy the show?" Ruth nodded vigorously, unable to speak, and Louis laughed warmly. The information in this video is compiled from documented interviews, archival news, books, and historical reports. For narrative purposes, some parts are dramatized and may not represent 100% factual accuracy. We also use AI-assisted visuals and AI narration for cinematic reconstruction. The use of AI does not mean the story is fake. It is a storytelling tool. Our goal is to recreate the spirit of that era as faithfully as possible. Enjoy watching. What happened next was something Harold would talk about for the rest of his life. Louis noticed that Harold was carrying an old trumpet case, not for show, but because Harold had brought his own trumpet, hoping Louis might sign it. The trumpet wasn't valuable in monetary terms. It was a second-hand instrument Harold had bought years ago with dreams of learning to play, dreams that work and responsibility had long since pushed aside. But to Harold, that trumpet represented something important: the belief that music could transform lives, could lift people out of hardship, could connect strangers across vast differences in circumstance and background. When Louis saw the trumpet, he asked if he could look at it. Harold nervously handed it over, and Louis examined it with the careful attention of someone who truly understood instruments. "This is a good trumpet," Louis said, running his fingers over the valves. "You play?" Harold admitted that he had tried to learn but never had enough time. That work always came first, that the trumpet had mostly sat in its case for years. Louis nodded understandingly. He had met many people like Harold, people whose dreams had been deferred by the necessities of survival. Then Louis did something unexpected. He took out a pen and signed the trumpet's bell, writing not just his name but a personal message: to Harold and Ruth. Keep the music alive. Louis Armstrong. Harold's eyes filled with tears. Ruth stared in amazement, and Louis, seeing their emotional reaction, reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 backstage passes for his next Chicago concert, scheduled for the following year. "Come back and see me," Louis said, "both of you. I want to hear how Ruth is doing." That signed trumpet became the most precious possession in the Mitchell household. Harold displayed it prominently in their small living room, and every time Ruth looked at it, she remembered that magical night when the greatest musician in the world had knelt down to talk to her, had remembered her name, had treated her father with dignity and kindness despite the obvious difference in their social positions. The trumpet wasn't just a souvenir. It was proof that kindness existed, that famous people could be genuinely good, that the world contained beauty and generosity alongside its hardships. For the next 3 years, Harold worked just as hard as before, but he seemed lighter, somehow happier, sustained by the memory of that encounter and the promise of returning to see Louis again. But fate had other plans. In the winter of 1951, Harold Mitchell began experiencing chest pains that he initially dismissed as stress from work. By spring, the pains had become severe enough that he finally went to a doctor and received news that devastated him. Harold had a serious heart condition, the same condition that had taken his wife Margaret 3 years earlier. The doctor told Harold he needed to stop working immediately, needed complete rest, needed expensive treatment that Harold's meager savings couldn't begin to cover. Harold tried to keep working anyway. He had to, because Ruth depended on him, but by summer his body simply couldn't continue. He collapsed on the factory floor and never returned to work. The next 6 months were the hardest of Ruth's young life. She watched her father grow weaker day by day, watched the savings disappear into medical bills and rent payments, watched everything they owned slowly get sold to pay for necessities. Ruth was 14 years old and suddenly facing a reality that no child should have to face. Her father was going to die, and when he did, she would be completely alone. Harold tried to prepare her as best he could, tried to arrange for relatives to take her in, tried to make sure she would be cared for after he was gone. But Harold's family was small and scattered, and most of them were struggling themselves. No one was in a position to take on the responsibility of raising a teenage girl. Have you ever had to sell something precious to survive? Share your experience in the comments. Harold Mitchell passed away in January of 1952, just 3 weeks after Ruth's 14th birthday. The funeral was small and quiet, attended only by a few neighbors and the minister from their church. Ruth stood at her father's graveside in a dress she had outgrown but had no money to replace, and she felt something inside her go numb. Not the sharp pain of fresh grief, but a hollow emptiness that came from realizing she was now truly alone in the world. The relatives who had promised to help didn't follow through. One had moved away, another was dealing with their own crisis, a third simply stopped returning calls. Ruth found herself living in the small apartment she had shared with her father, trying to figure out how to survive on nothing, knowing that soon even this meager shelter would be gone when the rent came due. For 3 months after her father's death, Ruth survived on the kindness of neighbors and the remnants of their possessions. She sold her father's clothes first, then the furniture, then the kitchen items they didn't absolutely need. Each sale brought a few dollars that stretched impossibly thin across rent, food, and basic necessities. Ruth tried to find work, but she was only 14. Too young for most jobs, too uneducated for the few positions that might hire someone her age. She considered lying about her age, but was terrified of being caught, of being labeled a troublemaker, of making her already desperate situation even worse. By April, Ruth had sold almost everything of value in the apartment, almost everything except the signed trumpet. The trumpet was the last thing Ruth wanted to sell. It was her father's most treasured possession, the symbol of the happiest night of their lives together. The physical proof that Louis Armstrong had once treated them with kindness and respect. But when Ruth counted her remaining money and realized she couldn't make rent, couldn't buy food for the next week, couldn't survive unless she found some source of income immediately, she made the hardest decision of her young life. She would sell the trumpet. It was signed by Louis Armstrong, so surely it was worth something. Maybe enough to get her through another month, maybe enough to buy her time to find some other solution. Ruth didn't know how much the trumpet was worth. She had no experience with such things. She decided to ask for $100, which seemed like an enormous sum to a 14-year-old who had never had more than a few dollars at a time. On that April morning in 1952, Ruth gathered the few remaining items she could sell, some toys from her childhood, a few records her father had loved, and the trumpet, and walked to a busy street corner where she had seen other people selling things. She spread out a worn blanket, arranged her meager merchandise, and sat down to wait for customers. Her eyes were red from crying. She had cried herself to sleep every night since her father died, and had cried again that morning when she took the trumpet down from its place of honor. But Ruth didn't cry now, sitting on that street corner. She had learned that crying didn't help, that tears didn't pay rent, that the world didn't stop for a girl's grief. So she sat dry-eyed and waited, hoping someone would buy something, hoping she could survive another day, hoping for a miracle she didn't really believe would come. If you're moved by Ruth's courage, please subscribe. What happens next will restore your faith in humanity. Meanwhile, just a few blocks away, Louis Armstrong was taking a break from rehearsal for his upcoming New York concert series. Louis had been working hard lately, too hard, his wife Lucille kept telling him, and he was tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. At 51 years old, Louis had been performing professionally for over 30 years, had achieved fame and success beyond his wildest childhood dreams, had done everything a musician could hope to do. But lately, Louis had been feeling something he rarely discussed with anyone. A sense of emptiness, a question about whether all his success actually meant anything, a longing for connection that performing for thousands of strangers couldn't satisfy. Louis loved his audiences, loved making people happy with his music, but he sometimes wondered if he was making a real difference in anyone's life or just providing temporary entertainment that people forgot as soon as they left the theater. Louis decided to walk to a nearby restaurant for lunch, wanting fresh air and a few minutes away from the pressure of rehearsal. The April day was pleasant. The streets were busy with New Yorkers going about their business, and Louis felt his mood lifting slightly as he walked. Then he saw the girl on the corner. At first, Louis barely registered her. Just another person selling things on the street, a common enough sight in New York. But something made him look twice. Something about the girl's posture or expression or the particular quality of her loneliness that caught his attention. Louis slowed down, looked more carefully, and noticed the items she was selling: toys, records, and a trumpet. The trumpet stopped Louis cold. Even from a distance, he could see it was a quality instrument, not professional grade, but decent, well-maintained, cared for. Louis approached, curious now, wanting a closer look. The girl looked up at him with eyes that were exhausted and hopeless and somehow still dignified despite everything. She didn't recognize Louis. Didn't realize that the middle-aged black man approaching her was one of the most famous musicians in the world. She just saw a potential customer and tried to muster enough energy to make a sale. "The trumpet is $100, Ruth said, her voice flat. "It's signed by Louis Armstrong. It's real, I swear. My father got it signed personally." Louis picked up the trumpet and examined it. The signature was his. He recognized his own handwriting immediately, the distinctive way he wrote his name. The personal message to Harold and Ruth that he now remembered writing 3 years ago in Chicago. Louis's heart began racing as memories flooded back. The father and daughter outside the stage door. The little girl's wide eyes, the father's tears of joy, the backstage passes he had given them, the promise to see them again. Louis looked at the girl sitting on the blanket and suddenly saw beyond the exhaustion and grief to the face beneath. Older now, thinner, marked by hardship, but unmistakably the same face of the little girl who had clutched her father's hand that night in Chicago. "Ruth," Louis said softly. "Ruth Mitchell." The girl's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. How did this stranger know her name? How did he know who she was? Ruth looked at Louis more carefully, and suddenly recognition dawned on her face. The face she had seen on album covers, on posters, in her father's treasured photographs from that magical night. Ruth's composure crumbled completely. She burst into tears, covering her face with her hands, sobbing in a way she hadn't allowed herself to sob since her father's funeral. Louis Armstrong was standing in front of her. Louis Armstrong remembered her name. Louis Armstrong was holding her father's trumpet, the trumpet he had signed, the trumpet she was trying to sell because she had nothing else left. Louis knelt down on the sidewalk, not caring about his clothes or the stares of passing pedestrians, and gently put his hand on Ruth's shoulder. "Where's your father, Ruth? Where's Harold?" Ruth couldn't answer through her tears, but she didn't need to. Louis could read the answer in her grief, in her presence alone on this street corner, in the fact that she was selling the trumpet Harold had treasured above all his possessions. Louis understood in that moment that Harold Mitchell was gone, that this child was alone, that the family whose joy he had witnessed 3 years ago had been shattered by loss and poverty. And something in Louis's heart, something that had been feeling empty and purposeless lately, suddenly filled with absolute clarity about what he needed to do. Louis helped Ruth gather her things, the toys, the records, the trumpet, and walked with her to the nearest restaurant. He ordered her the biggest meal on the menu and watched her eat with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in weeks. While Ruth ate, Louis asked gentle questions, and gradually the story came out. Harold's illness, his death, the vanished relatives, the sold possessions, the desperate attempt to survive alone at 14 years old. Louis listened without interrupting, his famous face showing an emotion that audiences rarely saw. Not the joyful entertainer, not the charismatic performer, but a man genuinely moved by another person's suffering, genuinely determined to help. When Ruth finished eating, Louis made a phone call to his manager, Joe Glazer. The conversation was brief and direct. Louis needed Joe to find out everything about Ruth Mitchell's situation, what relatives existed, what legal options were available, what resources could be mobilized to help a 14-year-old orphan who was about to become homeless. Joe Glazer had worked with Louis for decades and knew when Louis was serious about something. Within hours, Joe had identified a distant aunt of Ruth's who lived in Queens, a woman named Eleanor who had lost touch with Harold's family, but who, when contacted and told of Ruth's situation, immediately agreed to take her in. Eleanor wasn't wealthy, but she was kind and had a spare room, and believed that family should take care of family, even family they barely knew. But Louis didn't stop there. He set up a trust fund for Ruth's education, ensuring she would be able to finish school and attend college if she wanted. He arranged for monthly payments to Eleanor to cover the additional expenses of raising a teenager. He gave Ruth back her father's trumpet, refusing to let her sell it, telling her it was too precious to lose and that her father would want her to keep it. And he gave Ruth something else, something that couldn't be measured in dollars, his personal phone number and a promise that she could call him anytime, for any reason, for the rest of her life. "Your father was a good man," Louis told Ruth before they parted that day. "He loved you more than anything in the world, and I'm going to make sure you have the chance to become everything he dreamed you could be." Ruth moved in with Aunt Eleanor the following week. The adjustment was difficult at first. New home, new school, new neighborhood, grieving for her father while trying to build a new life. But Eleanor was patient and caring, and gradually Ruth began to heal, began to trust, began to believe that maybe she could have a future after all. The trust fund Louis had established paid for Ruth's schooling, and Ruth threw herself into her studies with a determination that would have made her father proud. She graduated high school with honors, then attended college, the first person in her family ever to do so, studying business because she wanted to understand how the world worked, how money flowed, how success was built. Throughout those years, Louis Armstrong kept his promise. He called Ruth regularly, checking on her progress, celebrating her achievements, offering advice when she asked for it. Whenever Louis performed in New York, Ruth and Eleanor would be in the audience with backstage passes, treated as honored guests, introduced to other musicians and industry professionals. Louis never made Ruth feel like a charity case or an obligation. He treated her like family, like the daughter he had never had, like someone whose success mattered to him personally. And Ruth, in turn, came to see Louis as the closest thing to a father figure she had after Harold's death. Not replacing her father, but honoring his memory by caring for the daughter he left behind. After college, Ruth took a job at a small record store in Manhattan. She started at the bottom, learning the business from the ground up, applying the work ethic her father had modeled, and the business knowledge her education had provided. Within 5 years, Ruth had saved enough to buy a small ownership stake in the store. Within 10 years, she owned it outright. Within 20 years, Ruth Mitchell owned 3 record stores across New York City, had become one of the most respected figures in the local music retail industry, and had built a life of stability and success that her father could never have imagined for her. Do you believe in fate, in the idea that some encounters are meant to happen? Share your thoughts below. Every 2 or 3 years, no matter how busy their lives became, Louis Armstrong and Ruth Mitchell would meet for coffee. They would sit in a quiet corner of some restaurant, away from fans and press, and talk for hours about music, about life, about Harold, about the strange and wonderful path that had led from a street corner in 1952 to wherever they currently found themselves. Louis watched Ruth grow from a grieving child into a confident young woman, into a successful businesswoman, and he felt a pride that he imagined must be similar to what parents feel watching their children flourish. Ruth watched Louis continue to perform and create and bring joy to millions, and she felt a gratitude that words could never adequately express. Gratitude not just for the material help he had provided, but for the simple fact that he had seen her, had remembered her, had chosen to care when he could easily have walked past. Their last meeting was in 1970, a year before Louis died. Louis was 70 years old, his health declining, his performing days mostly behind him. Ruth was 32, at the height of her business success, preparing to open her 3rd store. They sat in their usual corner, drinking coffee, talking about the past and the future. And Louis told Ruth something he had never said before. "That day I found you on the street corner was one of the most important days of my life," Louis said. "I had been feeling lost, Ruth. Feeling like all my successes didn't mean anything, like I wasn't really making a difference. And then I saw you, and I remembered what mattered, helping people, connecting with people, being there when someone needs you. You saved me that day as much as I helped you." Ruth cried when Louis told her that, not tears of sadness, but tears of love and gratitude and the overwhelming realization that this man, this legend, this giant of American music considered their connection as meaningful as she did. They embraced, promised to meet again soon, and went their separate ways. Louis Armstrong died on July 6, 1971. Ruth learned the news from a radio broadcast and wept for days, for Louis, for her father, for all the loss she had experienced and all the love she had been given. At Louis's memorial service, Ruth was among the thousands who gathered to honor him. She didn't speak, didn't try to claim special status among the celebrities and dignitaries, but she carried with her the signed trumpet, her father's trumpet, the instrument that had brought Louis into her life, and she held it close to her heart as she said goodbye to the man who had saved her. Ruth Mitchell lived until 2018, dying peacefully at 80 years old, surrounded by children and grandchildren she never would have had if Louis Armstrong hadn't stopped on that street corner in 1952. Her record stores remained successful for decades before eventually closing as the industry changed, but Ruth had diversified wisely and left her family well provided for. In her will, Ruth specified that her father's trumpet, the one Louis had signed, the one she had almost sold for $100, the one Louis had refused to let her give up, should be donated to the Louis Armstrong House Museum in Queens. Today, that trumpet sits in a display case with a plaque telling the story of Harold and Ruth Mitchell and the chance encounter that changed everything. But the real legacy of that day isn't a trumpet in a museum. It's the example Louis Armstrong set, the example of paying attention to people who are struggling, of remembering names and faces, of following through on promises, of using success and resources to lift others up rather than just accumulating more for yourself. Louis Armstrong could have walked past Ruth that day. He was busy, he was tired, he had a rehearsal waiting, he had 1,000 reasons to mind his own business and let someone else deal with a homeless teenager on a street corner. But Louis stopped. Louis remembered. Louis cared. And because Louis cared, a grieving child became a successful woman. A broken family line continued and flourished, and a story of compassion has inspired everyone who has heard it for over 70 years. The world is full of people like Ruth Mitchell, people who are one tragedy away from losing everything, people who are selling their most precious possessions just to survive another day, people who need someone to see them and remember them and choose to help. Most of us will never have Louis Armstrong's fame or resources, but all of us have the capacity to pay attention, to remember names, to follow through on promises, to help when helping is possible. Louis Armstrong taught the world to love jazz, but he taught Ruth Mitchell, and through her story taught all of us something even more valuable, that kindness matters, that compassion has power, that the smallest act of generosity can ripple through decades and transform lives in ways we can never predict. Somewhere in the Louis Armstrong House Museum, a trumpet sits in a glass case. It's not a valuable instrument, second-hand, ordinary, the kind of trumpet you might find in any pawn shop in America. But on its bell is a signature and a message to Harold and Ruth. Keep the music alive. Louis Armstrong. That message was written as a gift to a devoted father and his adoring daughter. It was almost lost forever when tragedy struck and desperation forced a child to sell her most precious possession. And it was saved by the same man who wrote it, the same man who remembered a little girl's name 3 years later, the same man who chose compassion over convenience and changed a life forever. Keep the music alive. That's what Louis Armstrong wrote on that trumpet, and that's what Ruth Mitchell did. Not by becoming a musician, but by living a life that honored her father's memory and Louis's generosity. By raising children who understood the importance of kindness, by telling this story to everyone who would listen, so that Louis's example would continue to inspire long after both of them were gone. The music Louis Armstrong created will live forever in recordings and history books. But the music of his kindness, the melody of compassion he composed on that street corner in 1952, that music lives in the hearts of everyone who hears Ruth's story and decides to pay a little more attention, remember a few more names, and help when helping is possible. That's the real legacy of Louis Armstrong. That's the song that never ends.